So this is John Costa at the Documentary Media Centre, and today I'm keeping up to date with our conflict memory and education project, and that involves talking to our researcher in residence here at the Doc Media Centre, Dr Paul Reilly. Paul, how are you this fine afternoon?
I'm good, thanks, John. How are you?
I'm good. So thanks for taking the time again to talk to us. I know you spoke to us a couple of weeks ago about your book. It was a year on. So it was good to catch up and review some of that and the feedback that you'd got. And also, I think, the relevance of it a year on and probably even further in the future. It'd be interesting to write a couple of versions of that as we keep going forward. But hey, that's anyone's interested in that. That was the previous interview that we did. We're going to be talking today about your Instagram project, which is where I think probably one of the very first things I ever interviewed you about, where you were researching images from the Troubles. And sort of looking at, the commentary, where they were from and the analysis and stuff like that. So again, I want to revisit that because social media has probably become even more of a thing than in the 2 years since we did that in our first conflict reportage newsroom, 24-hour newsroom. I think we first spoke about that. So, where's the project at the moment?
Well, I'm writing it up. So we're in a position where I presented at a few conferences, and a lot of the stuff that we talked about previously, I've got a lot more findings, data, looked at 100 images. And again, this project's been ongoing for the best part of a year, but it's really interesting to look at some of the visual representations, but also the comments. I mean, I think you hit it on the head how social media is so embedded in lots of people's lives. And I think the way memory works, there's a lot of research on this, but my stuff on Northern Ireland, looking at historical photographs, you do see people sharing images, some of which may feature them or their relatives, some of which may be people sharing them as whether they're enthusiasts about British military history or about other conflicts, where they share images of conflicts, and the responses they get can be very polarizing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at the time when we did the interview about it, I'd been watching quite a lot, well, as many documentaries as I could find around international photojournalists. So we kind of, we know of like your Don McCullens of the world and, your Tim Hetheringtons going off and doing these kind of international conflicts. Whereas I was looking at lots of sort of Spanish, Italian, Japanese and French photojournalists that were kind of using, I guess, Northern Ireland, a little bit of how maybe Don McCullum was using the Lebanon or something, it's going over. And so they have a very different view of the conflict as well. And I kind of almost like take in different images. And I like that. That's what I really think about some of these images that you picked last time when we spoke around how the British military was portrayed and how the sort of the people on the street, maybe that kind of famous mask wearing, almost like the stocking over the head, the black beret, the kind of the oversized American jacket with someone running down the road from the IRA, or the the UVF, or any of the sort of protagonists throughout it. It was always slanted towards their home audience, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of that, and again, it's the everyday life part of it. So on the one hand, you have, I looked at images which are tagged the Troubles. So again, these are Instagram users who are tagging content they want people to associate with that. And I think the period we looked at was 2019. So it was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bog sites. And you see people sharing images to mark anniversaries and significant ones. I mean, we've seen this very recently with Bloody Sunday, where there's a lot of photographic imagery produced by, yes, people like Don McCullum, freelance photojournalists who were effectively dropped into what was effectively conflict zones in Derry and Belfast, and spent a few weeks, took a lot of images and then left. So what they were seeing, you're right, there's that sort of theme about how they capture images, which you could link to yet Lebanon, even the Vietnam War at that time. There are elements where it was combat photography, war photography. Now, again, whether it was a war at that time, again, there are different interpretations. But this idea that, a lot of people are sharing this, again, British military enthusiasts sharing images of British soldiers in the streets. A lot of that is about what they're wearing, what they're holding in terms of, the armaments, the vehicles. There are a lot of elements which it's not really about the conflict at all. On the other hand, you have these really striking images of buildings collapsing, of people going about their everyday lives with a backdrop of, yes, British military personnel, IRA and loyalist gunmen, also just the dereliction, sort of wasteland behind it caused by this. And you have this sort of strange, almost juxtaposition of people going about their everyday business in amongst all this carnage and all this sort of conflict. So you do have these different perspectives. And I think what I've been interested in is very much, how do people respond to that? Lots of Instagram users, without wanting to generalize, are people who were not around during the late 1960s. I think it's fair to say that. But even a lot of people who use Instagram probably don't remember the Troubles themselves. And one of the things I'm sort of getting to grips with this study is how are their perceptions of the Northern Irish Troubles, the conflict itself, shaped by these images? Or do they come with their prejudices, and when they comment, they say things like, fuck the IRA or fuck the British Army? And some of the comments I've seen are very much like that, where it is people who have a prefixed view, who use that view in response to images, irrespective of what those images show.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I said, you kind of got me thinking there. What is the role of social media in this particular aspect when it comes to like Instagram and images? So the vast majority of those people, if they wouldn't have been born, and if you've got like children standing in doorways or things like that, you're talking like parents and grandparents now, aren't you, really? So these are like the grandchildren of these children now. The way that it presents itself, and it tends not to be the main events that people would know, or will be in the sort of public psyche, which invariably was like bomb attacks, or the main incidents, if you like, on both sides. You talked about Bloody Sunday. You've got Warren Point. You've got the various protests every year. It's interesting, actually. The documentary I rewatched there from Jason P. Howe called A Good Day to Die. He's doing a lot of stuff about Iraq, but again in Lebanon, so almost like ambulance chasing. And when the ambulance pulls up after the suicide bombing, the cameramen are almost like stopping the medical people doing their jobs because they're all falling over themselves, like the international press. And what you've got with something like social media, it's not that, is it? The Instagram images are more ordinary people, ordinary everyday life. You know what I mean? People kind of going about their business, shopping while the British Army's patrolling, things like that. Roadblocks and stuff like that.
Well, it's the interesting thing, and again, what I'm sort of toying with at the minute is this idea. I mean, these are historical images which have been available before the internet. So there's an element where you could crudely say getting a new life, because obviously people who can search on Instagram are going to come across images that they probably wouldn't have found, ordinarily. I mean, they aren't going to go into archives or buy photojournalism books about the conflict. So there is that element where, I mean, it is probably finding different audiences. The same degree, I suppose, we don't really know who's behind a lot of these accounts on Instagram. People don't often give a lot of information. So it's hard to say for sure that the people who are reacting to this are people who have no experience of that conflict at all. But at the same time, what you're right in picking up on is that in Northern Ireland itself, there are a lot of people who did not, were not around during the Troubles, who do valorize it, who do, almost are not eulogic about it, but are almost like, put the Troubles in some sort of, glorifying perspective, which obviously isn't true. And they do see images of conflict in that way, where it is perhaps a hark back to a time where perhaps they would have supported those groups too. And I think the big thing for me is that a lot of the photojournalists and the sort of iconic images, social media didn't make them iconic. I think they were reproduced in newspapers. There are things, I mean, Bloody Sunday, there are lots of images of that people probably know, as well as video footage as well in 72 that obviously are iconic because they are repeated a lot. They're in the sort of public psyche about what happens. And I do sort of this sort of tendency perhaps to think Instagram are making these visible. And what we don't see is, with all social media, what's under the bonnet. How algorithms, if I search for the Troubles, how is it presented? Those things are not always clear. And that might, of course, have an impact on memory, because how people remember conflict, it isn't often their personal experience. It is often experienced via images, via video. And of course, if Instagram decide what you see, and the most dominant images. And I looked at 100 all historical photographs. There's a breakdown there between, yes, British military, and also, Republicans, in terms of Republican violence, IRA men on the corner. But also you have these everyday images, which for me were the most interesting, because it did show people normalizing that level of violence. And I think normalizing things which perhaps people would think are anything but normal. And I think those images do show that.
How did you select the 100?
Well, it was a case of around the 50th anniversary of, the Battle of the Bogside. So in August 2019, we went into it and looked, obviously, with the Troubles hashtag to see what people were sharing at that time, or what was visible to people searching. So a lot of the things I'm looking at really are about how people use Instagram for memory work to effectively engage their memories. So it's them looking for images, and what those images then have, what significance they have for the person who's looking. And a lot of the things that come up with the Troubles are people beside peace walls, tourists in 2019 saying, I'm here, I'm putting that on it. We weren't really interested in that, more interested in historical photographs. And it was just the hundreds that came up from that. The first 100 was the sample. So again, 2-3 years on, I imagine if we were to look at images of the Troubles now, particularly in the last couple of weeks, we get a lot more images of Bloody Sunday than I found, which tended to focus really on the Battle of the Bogside and some of the things that were 50 years from that date. So yeah, there's an element where the search term's important, but it's also looking for the type of image. And with this, it was very prescriptive, looking for historical images reproduced on Instagram and how people reacted to it.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? But the sort of correlation, if you like, the connection, or whichever way you want to think about it, with your Twitter project, which we spoke about with your book, how you were looking at sort of Twitter and the way that was used for two particular periods during the Troubles, like parades and stuff like that. And then Instagram, do you see them as being similar in the way that they're used, or one's very kind of active and very kind of politically driven, like Twitter, whereas Instagram's more about, it's not about your affiliation, it's more about you can be anybody and interested in that period of time?
It's a bit of both. I mean, I think Twitter, most people's engagement is probably, in real time. I mean, if I think about like our use of it, we use it for news. You might occasionally look for, tweets about an issue, but you tend to use it more immediately. And it is more about news and information in real time. I think that's Twitter's strength. It is a microblog. So it is about tweeting content in a short period of time. So again, getting things trending. I think Instagram is different, because a bit like YouTube, it's a bit more static in terms of the content side of it, that, people will post up images. They may or may not get traction. They may or may not get liked. And they generally stay there unless they violate Instagram's policies. And I think what's that to me, the question, and I love to interview people who post these images and comment on them. I'm really curious about the motivation, because looking for the Troubles on Instagram, you assume that's someone who has an interest in it, but it could well be that, I mean, I've said this to you before, John, a lot of the people who look up these things on those platforms are probably researchers like me and you, looking for information relevant to what we're doing. I don't think people stumble across, I don't think people accidentally see I mean, you might see, if there was an album called The Troubles, perhaps someone might accidentally see an image of the Bogside in 1969, but it tends to be a very niche audience. And I think that probably, again, reflects the fact that people use that to engage memories that they have, or that perhaps their family members have, or perhaps they have no direct experience of at all, because they've that purpose. They do it as an intentional act.
When you'd done your 100 images, when you'd gone through and you'd selected them and stuff like that, did you find that once that project came to an end, that the algorithm kept serving up those kind of images for you for a while, and when you didn't engage any of them, it kind of changed the narrative? Because I always find that whenever I'm doing some kind of research, it will then continue serving stuff up. And obviously, I mean, it's a bit slightly different there, I guess, with the adverts as well, isn't it? You'll search for something on one platform, and then on that platform, suddenly you'll have an advert for it. There's definitely a connection there. There's someone listening for sure with what's going on.
There's like a churn, isn't there? I mean, again, I find that more because I use Twitter, to follow things every day. I probably get more targeted by that there. And obviously Facebook, if you have Facebook, you're well aware of you being targeted by what you search for. And I think there would be an element to that. Instagram, I don't tend to use Instagram prolifically. So I think perhaps I don't get that. I mean, you tend to get suggested accounts, obviously, and when you log on to Instagram. So if you were looking at a lot of images, I mean, a lot of the pages I looked at, were, people who were military enthusiasts, even some book publishers, because one of the things that Instagram is used very effectively for is promotion. And a lot of the images I took were people, publishing houses or bookstores publicizing a book on photojournalism during the Northern Irish, Troubles, and we're using Instagram to show it. And what's interesting there is that you probably wouldn't get this on Amazon, for example, unless you read the reviews, but you have people commenting on the images that are in a book that people who put those images up want you to buy, but you can see for free if you've got an Instagram account, or even you just log on and see it on Instagram too. So it's almost really reaching unintended audiences. Who those audiences are, that's probably a question I still have. I don't think, from what I've read and what I've done in this project, this isn't trolls or bots. These are people who are commenting on it, and very often these are people who are sometimes saying, "I was there," and you do have that a lot with the British military imagery. People going, I served in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, and I remember this well. Or people saying, "My father or grandfather." You have other people who it's just literally their view on who was right and who was wrong, who caused the Troubles itself, and there are elements of that kind of trolling too. But I think it's Twitter, you're more likely to get, people masquerading as others, where I think on Instagram, we don't see that as much. And that's been quite interesting to see.
Here's a question, hopefully, that is relevant. I was talking to someone the other day about how I used to do in conversations with military authors for Hellion Books, who do a lot of stuff through Casemate and stuff, which I should imagine you would have stumbled across during your research as well. And some of those conflicts were the image behind me, for example, there, sort of, Ken Hooper from sort of, African conflicts and stuff. And there's a very definite, in the books and in the audience, if you like, and the kind of afterwards as well, any kind of follow-up, that it happened. It was finite, it's ended. It's still real, and it's still impacted on the politics and today, but it was a period of time. I did one talking to a British soldier who, retired British soldier, who'd written about his experiences in Northern Ireland. And some of his old unit mates came along, and there was a real kind of camaraderie amongst them, which I kind of understood as well from being in the army myself a while ago. And what was interesting, though, was talking to him and some of those guys, it wasn't in the past. It was still real. And I'm thinking what you've got here really with Instagram and the work that you've done with Twitter as well, we call it the Troubles, and it has a kind of rough beginning date, doesn't it? And a kind of rough end date, but it's still real. It's a real thing. It feels, we talk about it as in like the past, but it's like I don't know, the Troubles 2.0. I don't know. I can't think of a better term for it to finish my question to you. Do you feel like some of the stuff that you're coming across now, it's almost, I mean, I think about, the potential prosecutions of British soldiers because of Bloody Sunday and stuff like that. Suddenly it's like the real narratives of the stuff that went on are still yet to come out from the protagonists on both sides, or all the various sides that are involved. There weren't two sides, was there? It was all the different sides. We've not actually had their narratives yet, because they can't let it out, because it's still a living thing.
I think you're right to pick up on the idea that this idea that the image is in the past and it's closed is never true. And I think there's an element of that what Instagram probably does is it reinvigorates an image which perhaps people may not have forgotten, but may not be as familiar with. And I think that's probably, think of anyone's use of Instagram to an extent. We put up content, we want people to see it. We want people to interact with it. And people revisiting photographs from 30, 40, 50 years ago have that intention. I suppose the question about narrative is a really important one, because I think that image behind you that I'm looking at now, the caption's still the narrative is still an important part of that. The narrative will not maybe change someone's mind on what they're saying, because they come with their own views of certain issues. But certainly without a narrative, it does leave things more open to interpretation. And I think Bloody Sunday is a really good example of the Widgery report into that, again, which was effectively a whitewash, which, denied any wrongdoing by British soldiers on the day in January 1972. I mean, the images taken by photojournalists were used as evidence that the British soldiers had been attacked and that their narrative was correct. And what you see since are a lot of those images have almost been reclaimed over the last 50 years by victims, the victims' families, people who were there, who obviously have a very different narrative to the official one. So it kind of shows how those images, if they're interwoven with a narrative on whether it's this conflict or that, can be very powerful, but they might not have only one meaning. And I suppose there is that issue about the photojournalist is always in a position where, generally photojournalists will want to, if they're during a conflict, they'll want to see not just the back of soldiers. They're going to see different perspectives. And very often it is the perspective of the civilian, of the protester, of someone who, again, who is facing off against, where it's army or police. And I do think there is an element where you have the potential for people to use those images now to also make a case around the Northern Ireland Protocol, the rights and wrongs of it, about whether peace and, again, transitional justice in Northern Ireland has occurred or could occur. And there are people who are still using these images as part of their narratives on who won the conflict, who won the war, you could crudely say, but also who won the war since. And I think there is a war over narrative about who started the Troubles, who was responsible for the Troubles being 30 years. And all sorts of questions about, yes, state involvement and state forces and their actions that we still have unanswered. I don't know whether we will. I think it's a different conversation for this, but, we haven't had truth and reconciliation, a process. I think that has inevitably led to victims on all sides. But, again, thinking of the Bloody Sunday inquiry, for example, where we do have people who feel that justice has not been served. And images are certainly a key part of that. And a key part of the Bloody Sunday family certainly was some of the images that we have almost burnt into our retinas about what happened. The TV image of the priest with the white hanky and the teenage boy being carried past soldiers. I mean, I would imagine most people in Britain know what that image is now. And we think back to 72 and what the media coverage was. It wasn't British soldiers kill innocent civilians. It was British soldiers involved in combat with IRA gunmen, and that's how things can shift.
I mean, how do you write up this project now? You said you're sort of writing it up at the moment. What will that look like when it comes out? Is it a book? Is it a kind of a different kind of presentation?
At the minute, it's an article, but I think it's one of those things where if it goes beyond that, I might have to look at different ways of publishing it. I mean, from my perspective, I mean, as an academic, clearly a journal article, I will not be able to put the same level and depth into it. I mean, I think also showing the images, there's sort of ethical issues about that. I mean, in a way, you could make the argument it's a public Instagram page, and people who are sharing that probably don't expect privacy as long as you link to them. I mean, I'm kind of conscious also that there could be a re-traumatizing effect in some cases. I mean, I think it's probably looking at where these images, who the people posting these images are, and also if they're using publicity for a book. I don't see that as particularly challenging, but I think it's probably a bit of both. I mean, I'd be keen to share the 100 images I looked at, maybe with the DMC, to actually, because they're Instagram images, they're publicly available. There's a way to present that online. It would be interesting to package that in a way where I was able to provide links to the images I looked at, even if I can't do that in an article or an academic output.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, is there like a sort of public custodian, if you like, of memory when it comes to Northern Ireland? I mean, are there archives that will take people's personal reflections and testimony and images and stuff like that? Does that exist? I know one shut, didn't it, just before COVID, which is quite a famous one you were telling me about that shut down.
Well, I mean, there are some archives. I mean, it's very piecemeal. I mean, I think officially there are public records office in Northern Ireland, like there would be over here, who do have archives of personal effects, which would include images. You do have the Kane project, the Ulster University operate, which is a really useful, fully open archive, which was going to shut in the last year, but got saved. So it found funding. But
that's good.
Again,
that's good news. Yeah.
It was one of those ones where, I mean, it is an awful lot of, if you're a researcher or you've an interest in the conflicts, it's a really good starting point. And there's a lot of stuff there, including images, which is open access. I mean, I think on the other side, you have obviously loyalist and Republican groups who have their own, again, oral history projects. And a lot of that stuff is increasingly online. So again, I mean, some of the stuff I've been interested in for a good 20 years is how websites, online platforms are being used for people to share images from obviously 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even going back to the 60s. And it's interesting again to see how, because there's no truth and reconciliation process, there is almost a sort of atomized, this is our history, this is what we remember of it, and using images as part of that. I mean, I think that reflects the fact that, for perhaps understandable reasons, whether it's loyalists or Republicans, they probably wouldn't have a lot of faith and trust in an official history or an official, photojournalistic account of the Troubles, because I'm sure they would say it was biased towards the other. And I think that's probably inevitable, even though combat journalists or photojournalists didn't set out to document one side's wrongdoings or misdoings. Clearly there are elements where they were seen as being, partisan by one side or the other during the conflict, and that continues, I think.
Final question. Where do your projects go from here? Something like, when you've done 100 images on Instagram for the Troubles, do you pick another major date and then look at another 100 and compare them? Do you look at a similar conflict scenario with just, low-level insurgencies, that kind of stuff? The FARC in Colombia, for example, is one that springs to mind. Do you sort of ETA in Spain? I mean, do you look at how those organizations are eulogized and represented on social media? Is that a good way of looking at it?
Possibly. I mean, I think my focus is still probably going to be primarily on Northern Ireland due to my personal interest in it, and obviously my research, having drawn that for a good 20 years. But I mean, I think what's interesting is there are themes here which I imagine would play out in terms of whether it's Israel, Palestine, or yes, Colombia, Cyprus. These are all conflicts where, they're within recent history where people remember them, albeit that those people who lived through them are probably a lot older and not the typical Instagram user. I'm kind of curious, I suppose, are there similar processes where it is people creating new forms of memory and engaging in that using what is effectively an old image reproduced on Instagram? So I am kind of curious to see whether that does play out in other contexts. And again, I mean, you've drawn on other examples. There are clearly a lot of conflicts which are remembered using images which are shared on sites like Instagram. It's not just a Northern Irish phenomenon or a British one for that matter. I think it's quite a common theme.
Yeah, it'd be quite interesting to get a group of people from all sides of the argument together to turn around and say, what does this image represent to you, and what image does this represent to everybody else? Because that's sort of the beginnings of not so much truth and reconciliation from a sort of a large level, but just from sort of people on the ground of conflicts and stuff. Because ultimately, these are the people that then have to live together and rub along once the politicians have decided that it's over. It's Monday tomorrow, and they get up and they crack on, and they don't see much visible difference apart from the papers talking about it all being over. And here we are still having incidents happen and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, I think it's a good point in terms of, you sort of think the Holocaust is the example I go to in terms of the imagery of that, again, is used to educate kids across the world about, some of the horrors of World War II and about Nazi Germany and what happened to the Jewish people during that. I mean, we see Holocaust denial now, 80 years on. We see where people perhaps need to be reminded of that. And the one thing I was just thinking of when you were saying that, the Holocaust Museum in Berlin has some really, really harrowing graphic imagery about what happened. And again, what I thought was always very impressive when I went there a few years ago they had school, parties going through, I mean, children who obviously it would be their great grandparents that were around that time, who were obviously, being taught about it, and they were not trying to hide or conceal what happened there. So an ugly, terrible part of their national history, and it was on display. And I sort of wonder, you could optimistically say we need to look at the past to avoid making the same mistakes, to avoid the same atrocities, the same injustices. Maybe photographs have a role in that. And again, a museum is obviously an important part of that. And that Berlin one is one I would count to. There are a lot of projects. There's one on the Holocaust online, which looks really fascinating. And obviously Julian Harrison, friend of the center, has done a lot of work on this. We're using online resources to effectively educate people who maybe don't have that in their own lived experience about what happened. And I do think we need to do that. I do think we need to think also about the narratives, and yes, about why people are sharing those images and why people respond in those ways. And it's not a surprise to me, or it would be you, John, either, that British soldiers in 1971 on the streets of West Belfast posing for photographs, and there are people in the comments going, "Get the British out of Ireland." That's not exactly a new trope or a new saying, is it? But again, asking why, having the conversation, is a photograph a prompt to have that conversation? Is it a way, it's not just about the people who were there, it's about the people who followed them, and them thinking about what that must have been like. I mean, we don't get empathy unless we try and put ourselves in the shoes of someone else. And I do wonder again, whether it's about Northern Ireland or about other conflicts, maybe that's what we need to do. We need to build more empathy through thinking of what someone's experience was 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and trying to avoid things which might lead to a repeat. And I think that today of all days, we're recording this on the day when the protocol checks have stopped, and there's again serious concerns about whether the Northern Ireland Assembly will be pulled down. Maybe we need to keep thinking back to what the conflict was like to avoid anything which might lead to another one.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Julian's project there, all the photographs that he's taken on his own research trips into his own family background of it. I think that project, that online project, the shower project, is even more impactful for me because it almost shows you what it's like today. You know what I mean? Yeah. Sort of street corners and things like that, where you imagine you're standing there 70 years later taking that photograph 70 years ago. This is the backdrop for this famous photograph. So maybe some of those photographs that you picked out from your 100 there, if you to kind of reproduce those in those in the exact spots, if you could find them, that person was just going about their day like you were on this day, so many years ago, and then this happened, and this is our image of it, not of the story of the person that was actually there. So I guess you're right, isn't it? So it's about having to re-own the narratives of some of these images as well, which is, this is something that happened at this time, at this moment, and defined what it was, but at the same time the impact on these other people, because I'm sure with family loss and all sorts of injuries and psychological trauma and stuff like that, it's there was a lot more people affected than whatever the official head count or body count or whatever terms casualties were. It's almost a collective community traumatism on all sides, isn't it?
Well, I mean, again, I think there's some really good stuff there we can learn from Germany. I mean, I'm not just thinking about the Holocaust, but in Berlin itself, obviously the number of people who died crossing the wall and the wall memorial, that there is an element where, you're obviously, walking on, in the shadows of other people, in the footsteps of other people. And I do think there's an element of that where I think Germany's been quite open about its history, about some of the worst aspects of it. And I think in Berlin, you do sort of get a sense that when you see where the wall was, and again, it's often just marking on the road, and then see what's happened since. Obviously, Germany has invested a lot of money in Berlin to modernize it. So, again, it's certainly a very different place now. I think in Northern Ireland, you almost have that scenario where, yes, there are memorials to atrocities, and there are Republican memorials and Loyalist memorials, as well as, perhaps ones dedicated to police and military. But you also have this issue where there isn't a shared space for that. I don't think we're there yet for that idea that you would have a place which was, we're remembering all victims, we're not prioritizing or ranking. We're going to say this is for everyone who died in it. And I sort of think, if you were in a position where, I mean, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin with the stones is incredibly striking and atmospheric and a very strange thing to visit. That to me is not trying to hierarchize anyone within that. It's a memorial to everyone who was affected by that. Something similar to that, if we were in a better place, maybe we'd be talking more about how we build shared narratives rather than still revisiting who was at fault, who caused it, and who was the worst offender. I think we're still, to a certain extent, in that mindset, and we're still maybe due to politicians on both sides who benefit from division because they can obviously say vote for us so the other side get in, don't really want to have that conversation. And I think that's, sadly, I think where we're at now, particularly with Brexit, where we have these sort of divisions between green and blue still playing out, where there's not a shared agenda to deal with legacy of conflict, and we need to have it.
Yeah. So when's your article due out?
Oh, good question.
I thought I'd catch you out with that unexpected one at the end there. Yeah.
Depends where I publish it. Hopefully at the end of the year. I mean, again, it's something I'm working on now. I mean, I think we should probably talk about doing something separate with the DMC anyhow, just because it would be good to get something involved in the images out too. But hopefully there'll be an academic output this year, depending on reviewers. But yeah, been a long time in process.
Some kind of exhibition would be quite cool to be able to digitally represent those images, and then have maybe get a focus group of people together. That'd be quite interesting.
Or get a photographer. I mean, get somebody who actually was there at the time. I'd be really curious. I mean, there are obviously lots of exhibitions, and McCullen is one who obviously has his work has toured probably more than you two in the last couple of years. So I mean, there's an element where it'd be nice to actually get a perspective. Don McCullen's books, I mean, I'm sure, John, you've seen them. There's not a lot dedicated to his experiences in Northern Ireland, but it's interesting nonetheless for him talking about. There's a couple of anecdotes about how the military and police saw him on the other side, and obviously I think he describes them being suspicious of him when he came back towards them, when he was actually there as a member of the press pound, and elements where how he felt very alien to us because it was not the same as being in Great Britain. It was not British in that sense. It felt like a different place. I really find that really fascinating when you have photojournalists talking about what they saw and their experience as the observer, not just what they captured, but how they felt. So I'll be interested to hear more about that from other contributors to the conflict memory theme within the centre, because it's a really interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and again, it's conflict memory. I mean, and education. The education part is something that's needed, particularly around young people and them understanding that it's easy to get sucked into some of this misinformation and disinformation about what these images represent and what the actual context was behind it. And so images actually become quite powerful to this generation because they're used to having their news or things to follow, or, are they being influenced, if you like, in their particular view of something happening because it's being served to them in a way they understand, which is the images are coming back and are actually even more powerful and more well known.
Definitely, yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. Good to speak to you.
Thanks, John.